coming for the 5th Barry Moss speaker. I think you're going to enjoy the evening tonight. The program is planned to allow time for questions, and I'm very pleased to have one of the members of the Moss Committee to be the introducer, our good friend John Gurman. John?
Good evening. Before we get to the business of introductions, there are a couple of preliminaries that I need to mention. Number one, there's a very dedicated committee which puts this thing together every year, and I'd like to ask the members of that committee who are in attendance if you would kindly stand up and be recognized. We do the easy part. The real work is done by two people who organize it and advertise it and pull it off. Without them, without these bellwethers, we wouldn't be here this evening. And it's no secret that you need to know for sure who they are. Tom Moore and Georgia Piazza. Our format this evening is a simple one. It's introduction, presentation, Q&A. Okay. So this evening, as Tom mentioned, marks our 5th annual J. Barry Moss Distinguished Speaker Series, named, as is this room, in memory of an incredibly talented faculty member and administrator. Our speaker, with his love of learning, his commitment to equity and balance, and to the values of individualism, his enthusiasm for public discussion, and even his interest in matters religious and philosophical. That's about as Barry Moss-ish as you can get. And of course, he knew Barry. He taught here during interim term, which was Barry's invention, really. Barry was the principal who guided his kids at the time, so he's very much familiar with this environment. J. Pittman McGehee is an Episcopal priest. He's a union analyst in private practice here in Houston. He is widely known as a lecturer and educator in the field of psychology and religion, as well as a published poet and essayist. He received his Master of Divinity degree from the Virginia Theological Seminary and was ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church in 1969. He received an honorary doctorate of divinity from the Episcopal Seminary of the Southwest. Many of y'all know him as the former dean of the Christ Church Cathedral downtown from 1980 to 1991. He currently has an exceedingly busy schedule doing what he truly loves to do, lecturing and teaching, practicing analysis, and writing. In that last field, he has published 4 books, or is about to have published 4 books. The Invisible Church, Finding Spirituality Where You Are, Raising Lazarus, The Science of Healing the Soul, Words Made Flesh, selected sermons of his. And coming out, hopefully in 10 days, his 4th called The Paradox of Love, based on lectures that he has presented at the Jung Center here in town. That book, by the way, and he did not pay me to do this, okay? But the book focuses on the interpersonal and intrapsychic dynamics of love, its light and dark sides, its mystery. He currently blogs for the Huffington Post. And here are a couple of samples that I lifted from the Post. The Christ is anywhere there is need. He is more easily seen by those who have immediate needs, but he is more needed to be seen by those who have fewer needs. And then this one, which sounds like Barry Moss incarnate. For some, questioning the purported infallibility of the Bible is heretical. For others, it's liberating. I say, take whatever train that will get you where you need to go. My own liberation train helps me become my own authority, granting myself the right to critique the self-appointed religious authorities and power brokers, both past and present. Dr. McGehee is now the director of the Institute for the Advancement of Psychology and Spirituality. He is as well a diplomate Jungian analyst and a faculty member of the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland. So, unlike the rest of us in this room, he just seems to be getting younger and younger. And perhaps most importantly, he is one of our own. He is a Kincaid parent. Young Pittman was in the class of 1989, and Jarrett was in the class of 1994. He has spoken here on many an occasion, including commencement speaker, in the year that his second son graduated, 17 years ago. He has taught that class in decision-making and in order terms. He's a very special Kincadian for sure. Before we bring him up here, however, you need to know something. He is a self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninist. The first, I'm sure, ever to speak at Kincaid. However, you also need to know that he is referring to Groucho Marx and John Lennon. To quote Pittman one more time, quote, "I identify with Groucho because he said he would never belong to any club that would have him as a member. And in my Jungian analytical work and my early work as an Episcopal priest, I've often heard this same sentiment echoed about organized religion or church. I love John Lennon because he exhorted us to imagine, which is where we ultimately find God and the divine. For myself as a Jungian analyst, one of the most important lifelong tasks I continue to undertake is to offer hope, insight, and healing for people who feel wounded by religion. If I could somehow, by proclamation, heal every broken and self-estranged soul out there, I would gladly retire to a life of fishing." So, proclaim away, Dr. J. Pittman McGehee.
I'm told that introduction is in lieu of an honorarium. It's nice to be back among the Kincaid family, and I've been here all day speaking to the students this morning, having lunch with a selected few students, very stimulating dialogue over lunch, and then coming back tonight to be with you. John's right. I was a friend of Barry Moss's. I had great respect for Barry, his curiosity, his academic excellence, and his teaching and pedagogical abilities. Both of my boys would list Barry as one of their favorite teachers in their Kincaid experience. He was theologically trained, being a graduate of the Harvard Divinity School, and so he and I had several stimulating conversations, and so I am thrilled to be the Barry Moss lecturer for this year, and I do dedicate this lecture in the memory of Barry. About the time that I think the world doesn't need another word from me, an invitation like this comes, which gives me an opportunity to serve my purpose, which is to be about the task of using my words as resources for healing, for bringing people to new consciousness, for provoking and challenging, in order that we expand consciousness to include things that we need to be included in our consciousness. So this evening I want to introduce the 4 cornerstones of the human organism that are absolutely essential for any human being in order to live an integrated and balanced life, or if we got even more grandiose, to live a life of wholeness. Now, I'm not sure wholeness is ever ultimately and finally possible. Even the word itself creates for us a kind of sense of awe and mystery about what that might mean. Wholeness is like truth or beauty or other concepts. It's something at a deeper level we know. It's difficult to articulate what it looks like. I don't know that we would recognize wholeness if we ever saw it, or I suspect if one ever became whole, they would be assumed immediately into heaven. And I think death probably is a requirement for wholeness. But nonetheless, it is a goal. And it's like the great poem Ithaca. Ithaca was never the goal. Ithaca was the occasion for the journey. And so wholeness is not our goal, it is the occasion for our journey toward it. The four cornerstones of the human being are that we are bio, psycho, social, spiritual beings. And that for us to consciously be in some kind of relationship to those four cornerstones of the human organism, I think is essential for health, for wholeness, for a sense of well-being. We in Western culture, most particularly those of us who have been raised in the Judeo-Christian culture, don't have a very good track record about healthy attitudes toward our bodies. For most of us, most of our lives, our body has been an enemy, something that we feared, something that we were suspicious of, and something that we were ashamed of. We are biological beings. Our body is the embodiment of our soul. Ida Rolf, who is famous for founding a school of Rolfing, a physiologist, Ida Rolf says that the body is the psyche in 3 dimensions. Now, except for didactic or teaching purposes, we cannot make the separation of any of these four cornerstones from the other because they are intricately woven together. They are an integrated whole. It's just whether our consciousness and our attitude and behavior isn't somehow in concert with each of these. We are psychosomatic beings. That is to say, we can't separate psyche from soma except for didactic purposes. And our body, therefore, houses our soul. And our soul and bodies are inseparable. We are body-soul. And so for us to pay attention to our bodies is absolutely essential for us to be in harmony with our souls. If we spin it fast enough, we begin to realize that our bodies and our souls and our psyches and our spirits are inseparable. The wild-eyed British engraver, William Blake, says that the 5 senses are the inlets of the soul. The 5 senses are the inlets of the soul. Taste, touch, sight, sound, smell. Can you imagine your life without a sensorium through which you can experience life in the world? We've been given a sensorium out of which we can experience life. I've never, in all my years of analytic practice and as a priest of the church, ever had a soul come into my office apart from a body. Our bodies locate us and identify us, and they give us a sensuous pleasure of being alive. Music and gourmet food. I don't know the difference between those two things in a spiritual life. Somebody asked me one time, sometimes, McGehee, when I hear you talk, I think you think that, say, gourmet food is holy. I said, well, it is divine. Taste, touch, sight, smell. What would we do without our bodies? Business thinks that the body is a product. Medicine thinks it's a machine. Church thinks it's a sin. The body says, I'm a fiesta. We need to love our bodies and not be ashamed of them or afraid of them. We need to have a relationship with our bodies. We need to be in our bodies. We need to be proud of our bodies. We need to be thankful for our bodies. We need to embody ourselves in this incarnate being called the body. Of all the people on earth, I happen to be a Christian, and even more dramatically, I happen to be a priest. And for almost 40 years, I've stood at the table of my people and lifted up a piece of bread and said, this is my body. We believe in the incarnation, that God comes to us in flesh. There's a story told of the little boy who had lost his mother, and a great thunderstorm came, and he was crying unconsolably, and his father came to him and said, "Son, it's okay. Don't you know God's here for you?" He said, "Yeah, but I need God with skin on him." And can we not elevate our bodies to the place that we see them as holy, sacred, sacramental? Our bodies must really love us the way we treat them. To have a sound physical exercise program is absolutely essential. To care for what we put in our bodies is absolutely necessary. And I've come tonight just to remind us that one of the cornerstones of the human being is our body, that we don't think about very much and we don't care about enough. Our psyches are everything about us that's not body. Everything about us that's not flesh and blood and hair and bone is called a psyche. The etymological root of the word psyche in the Greek comes from the same root as the word butterfly. And we believe that's because the psyche is invisible, though present, like the wind on which the butterfly floats. But also because the butterfly is in a process of metamorphosis, continually changing. One of my mentors theologically is a Scottish theologian named John Macquarie. And Macquarie says we should not refer to ourselves as human beings, but as human becomings. Psychologically speaking, we are born at a particular time, particular place, particular set of parents. We are both heirs and victims of a birth we did not request and a grave we cannot escape. So what are we supposed to do in the meantime? Well, we're to become. And we're to become that concept that God had at your conception. When you were conceived, there was a concept, and that's you. Never before, never again. Psychologically speaking, your job is to heed that call. If you remember from the Latin, vocare means to call. So our vocation is not priest, analyst, doctor, or lawyer. Our vocation is to become that person we were created to be. Psychological health and mental hygiene presumes that you are comfortable in being that human being you were created to be. Born at a particular time, at a particular place, with a particular set of parents, never before, never again, you have a job, a vocation, a calling. And that is to be that true, unique, authentic, autonomous human being you were created to be. The paradox of human individuation, becoming whole, is that I alone must become myself, but I cannot become myself alone. So to be empowered to become yourself, we need companions, we need guides, we need mentors, we need people who will mirror back to us how they know us so we can know ourselves better. We need support systems. We need others. So in addition to our bodies and our psyches, we need a social network, as it were. When we talk about being bio-psycho-social beings, when we talk about social in this context, we're not talking about country clubs or garden clubs. We're talking about support systems. People who love you and know you and have your best interest at heart. I suspect the most undervalued form of love in our culture is friendship. The Greeks called it philia. If you want a good reference on the Greek understandings of love, I refer you to The Paradox of Love by the very Reverend Dr. J. Pittman McGehee. Friendship, support system. Our social life is not about trying to fit ourselves into some kind of social group. Our social life, our social being, that's a cornerstone of being human, is finding support systems. You go to the School of Public Health at the Medical Center, and their researchers will tell you that they can do the same medical procedure on two different people. One person will prosper and the other won't, and the one who prospers is the one who has family and friends who are supporting them. You gotta have friends. And so to have in your life family and friends is absolutely essential. And I suspect that friendship is indeed the most undervalued form of love that we have in our culture. And so to have a friend is to be a friend. And to cultivate friendship and social networking and finding those with whom you can be yourself. Somebody who knows you. I had a woman come into my practice several years ago and sat across from me, and through her tears, she said, I've come here so that before I die, somebody will know me. It's a sad thing that she has to come and pay me so that I can know her. Well, of course, you can't pay me for what I do. The money I get for what I do pays for the light bill and the rent. You can't buy my love. Knowing you. And so once again, in an ironic or paradoxical sense, the thing we desire the most is the thing we fear the most. So I want to be known and I want to be loved, but that scares the hell out of me because I'm afraid that if you really know who I am, you might reject me or abandon me. That's why we need other forms of love, like agape, as the Greeks talked about, which is that unconditional love. The love God has for us. God knows God must love us. That grace of undeserved favor that we all receive because we have our own instinctuality, our dark sides and our back sides that we're ashamed to share with anyone, except maybe with a close friend, someone who knows us. Trust is necessary for being intimate with another. Intimacy is described as self-disclosure in the face of another that you value. If you're self-disclosing in the face of somebody you don't value or don't know, that's called exhibitionism. That's what people do to me on an airplane when I'm wearing my clerical collar. I don't want to know what you're doing with your secretary. That's too much information. That's exhibitionism. Intimacy is self-disclosure in the face of another that you know and value, sharing feelings, fantasies, fears, and failures. 4 F's of intimacy. But trust is important, and trust has 3 ingredients. You have to believe the other person has your best interest at heart. You have to believe that they are competent to be in a friendship. And the third, that they're reliable and that they are predictable. And you can trust that person who has your best interest at heart, who's competent, and who's reliable and predictable. You can open your kimono with them. And to be known and seen as you are, and for them to mirror back, and then to love you in spite of it, allows us and empowers us to love ourselves. The self-love is something that no system tends to teach. We tend to think of that as autoerotic or narcissistic, when self-love is absolutely essential for mental health. And so if we are being in a social network or support system, that system ought to be energy for empowerment of our having compassion, love, and esteem for ourselves. The 4th cornerstone of the human being is spiritual. We're spiritual beings. Every person alive is a spiritual being. Not every person alive is conscious of their spirituality. My definition of spirituality is the deep human longing to experience the transcendent in the immanent. The deep human longing to transfer the transcendent from up there, out there, in some anachronistic, archaic God image projected onto the heavens, and to translate that into the experience. As I'm fond of saying, God is not a concept, God's an experience. We can't conceive of God. Any concept we have of God says more about us than it says about God. And we project all kinds of human, as it's called, anthropomorphic ideas onto God. I suspect if horses have a God, their God looks like a horse. And we keep trying to make a human being out of God. God is beyond comprehension, ineffable. The mystic Meister Eckhart says, the only image of God to have is no image. But seek the experience of the transcendent in the immanent life. Immanent is spelled two ways, I-M-M-I and I-M-M-A. When you're from small-town Oklahoma, it's difficult to pronounce the difference between an I and an A. Eminent and immanent. When I was in seminary in homiletics class, my professor said, Pittman, that was an excellent sermon. As a matter of fact, I was elected the senior preacher in my class at the Virginia Seminary. But you're going to have to work on your articulation and pronunciation. He said, evidently in Oklahoma, you don't know the difference between an I and an E. In other words, you think that that roof and the number are the same. 10 and 10. Now I said, it doesn't really make so much difference. It actually has a little bit of a kind of humble charm about it, but it's going to be a problem for you in the church because there's a difference between L-E-N-T and L-I-N-T. He said, one is in the church calendar, the other's in your belly button. I've never forgotten that. So it's hard to understand the difference in my articulation between eminent and immanent. I-M-M-I means indwelling. I-M-M-A means near at hand. Both work. What we want is an experience of the transcendent, the divine, the sacred, the holy, the mysterious. We want that in our ordinary life. Spirituality is a simple formula. We want to experience the extraordinary in the ordinary, the miraculous in the mundane, and occasionally to see that the sacred may be camouflaged in the profane. But to try to experience the transcendent in your ordinary life. Going back to our bodies, tasting God in our food, in our very being, in our bodies, in sights and sounds. There are 7 traditional ways that we experience the transcendent in our ordinary lives. In nature, the topography of the spiritual journey is about mountaintops and deserts. Andrew Weil, the holistic physician, wrote in an article recently in Time magazine that there's a new diagnostic category coming that's called nature deprivation. And that we have a generation of adults and children, most tragically children, who spend no time outdoors. They're inside all the time and are not getting good vitamin D, not getting the good energy that comes from flora and fauna, not being outside. And when I was a young boy growing up in small-town Oklahoma, for my brother and me, the worst form of punishment was, you're going to have to stay in the house today. Of course, there was nothing to do in there. And no machinery, no cell phone, no TV. Nature is one of the ways we experience the transcendent. Einstein said God is not devious, but God is subtle. And God has woven God's self into creation for those who have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. The same William Blake that I referenced earlier said, to see the world in a grain of sand, heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and see eternity in an hour. That ability to see. And so consciousness is about training ourselves to begin to look in an ordinary life for the extraordinary. And there's nothing more ordinary than nature, nothing more mundane than being outside. But you can sit in your backyard for a cycle of seasons and look at that tree in your backyard and see the whole story played out. Eliot said that April is the cruelest month. And the reason for that is that tree you're watching has in it a flower. And it labors to work its way out of that limb into a knuckle bud, which will become a bloom and then a blossom. How can you not see that? Who has the eyes to see and the ears to hear that the whole story is told in that? And then further, if you watch for a cycle of season, that knuckle bud, which becomes a bloom and blossom, will then eventually fall. And the green turns to gold and then to brown. And it falls to the ground. And the cycle of seasons begins again. In the Judeo-Christian story, we live our lives between the tree in the garden and the tree in Gethsemane. Here's the tree now as a metaphor of something sacred. Tree is the symbol of life. And to watch your own life mirrored in that tree is to be a spiritual being. And when we see that, we begin to see that there is an archetypal sense in life for each of us spiritually, that life is full of beginnings, ends, and new beginnings, of life, death, and new life, of creation, destruction, recreation. In the Judeo-Christian story, and particularly in the Christian story, we see it at Christmas, Good Friday, and Easter. That's the heartbeat and the breath drawn of the spiritual body that says life is beginnings, ends, and new beginnings. Life, death, new life. And the tree is telling us that. And we can see it in our backyard. That's the heartbeat and the breath drawn. That's the beat to which the rhythm of life is going. So give me the beat, boys, to free my soul. I want to get lost in your rock and roll to drift away. Now that's the kind of attitude, it seems to me, that's spiritual. And another place that we experience the transcendent is in creativity. Let me make it simple for you. The Creator has put a spark of the Creator in creation in every creature, and when we create, we're recreating, and there's us experiencing the transcendent. Create something. Make something. Bring something into being. Ritual process. We go through rituals all day, and we're not even aware of them. Why can't you make your life a religious ritual, a sacred ritual? Elevate your normal life into something extraordinary. Each of us gets up every morning, has a morning ritual. We go to our sanctuary laboratory. We eliminate, we cleanse, and we adorn. That's a ritual, and we each have it. Why couldn't you elevate it to something sacred, something extraordinary? It's good to be alive. It's good to have another day. And to be able to take your meals and make them sacramental. Maslow talked about the hierarchy of needs. It's the same for a sacramental principle or a spiritual principle. We all have an appetite for food, right? We have to refuel. But if we meet our need, basic need for food, then we're able to elevate food to a symbol of a relatedness or a connectedness in our social system. Can you see now that we're talking about body, and we're talking about psyche, and we're talking about social, and we're talking about spiritual, and we're spinning so fast that one feeds the other. There's no difference finally. I don't know the difference in physical exercise and spiritual exercise. I don't know the difference between eating food and ingesting you. If I call you and say, would you like to get a drink? Neither of us is thirsty. Except for one another. If I call you to have a meal, it's not because we're hungry. It's because we want to know one another. And we have our ritual. Just like in church, you know, we have a welcome and we tell a story and we try to connect it to something that's going on in our lives. And then we eat, and then we thank, and then we go home. the same at your house. Why can't you think of that as something spiritual? Why couldn't that be extraordinary in the ordinary? Why is it that we can't see the spiritual life that we live, that we're not conscious that it's spiritual? Make it holy. Somebody comes to your house, you say, welcome, come in. Tell me the story. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What do you do? Who are you? I want to know you. I want to ingest you. I want you to be a companion. You know the word companus, the word companion comes from Latin cum panis. It means with bread. A companion is somebody with whom you break bread. Now you can take this spiritual thing and throw it all the way up to make it a sacrament. We Christians get together on Sunday, have a meal. Sacramental principle says if you can see the presence of the divine in that meal at church, then you can see it in your meal at home. Now, we are ritual-making people. God knows we experience the transcendent in love. I say in the invisible church, God is love and everything else is commentary. And what we're talking about here is the experience of the divine, the sacred, the transcendent that comes to us when we're empowered by the love of another. The important thing to realize now is that if you touch all four bases, if you touch any one of the bases, you're touching all four. And that's so important for us to remember. Somebody asked me several years ago, I would really like to see you teach a course on sex. I said, well, the reason I've never done that is we would have such a crowd control problem. But indeed, when we talk about body and psyche and social and sacred, we're talking about human sex or sexuality, we're touching all four bases. But it doesn't have to be that. If you ask me, say, hey, Pittman, listen, I would like to touch all four bases simultaneously today, what should I do? And I said, well, take a walk outside with a friend. Can't think there's going to be anything to be healthier for you, psychologically, physically, socially, or spiritually. This stuff is not difficult, but don't confuse simple with easy, because we have so many distractions. We have so many pulls against consciousness. And so for us to live a healthy, balanced, integrated life, it requires consciousness and commitment. And that's laborious and difficult. And we don't have any universities that are teaching consciousness. As Jung said, there's no midlife university. Would you like to be the fundraiser for a midlife university? All right, so what I'm positing tonight in these words in memory of Barry is that it is possible to lead a wholesome life. Maybe we won't be whole, but we can be wholesome. We can be well met in the world if we pay attention to our bodies. Be good to our body, love our body, don't be ashamed or afraid of our bodies, but be in relationship with our bodies and think for a moment, I don't have a body, I am a body. What do you embody? Well, it's your psyche. And who are you? Well, you are you, and there's never been a you before, and this is a sacred, moral obligation you have to become the best possible you can, and to become the best possible, true, authentic, autonomous self that you can. And by autonomous, I mean you're your own authority about what it means to be you. Nobody can tell you. And most of us have spent our lives adapting and conforming to external authorities that have told us who we were, and we've tried to be that, and it never has worked. That's not who I am. That's why we need real companions, rather than external authorities who are trying to mold us into what they need us to be. True love empowers you to be. Agape, as we talked earlier, is the love that lets be, not in the apathetic sense, but in the empowering sense. God lets us be. That's empowering. so that we can discover through our own circuitous route who we are. I talked with young people this morning about life being a labyrinth. The difference between a maze and a labyrinth is if you get in a maze, you can get lost and never get out. If you get in a labyrinth, if you just keep moving, you'll get home. You'll be dead ends and circuitous routes, but you'll get there. Just keep moving. So in life's labyrinth, you will find home. As Joseph Campbell said, you have to leave home to find it, though. Eliot says, after all years of wandering, we will come home and know it for the first time. Okay, so here it is, all in a moment, the 4 cornerstones of the human organism, or the touchstones of wholeness. And I have come here tonight to authorize you to become conscious, to authorize you to be a body, to be a soul, to be a psyche, and to be a lover, and to be a holy, sacred, divine human being. Amen.
Q&A time.
Doctor, as I work on the good health of my body in the gym here lately, I've noticed that tattoos are becoming more and more popular.
Yeah.
And some of them I see appear to me to be pagan.
Yeah.
And I wonder if someone commemorating the cross of Jesus as a marking on their body, and then someone else creating a tribute to the feeling of riding a Harley-Davidson motorcycle
Right.
on their body. Could you elaborate on just your perspective on, is there a good and a bad tattoo?
Do you want to see mine? Well, as we were talking earlier, you know, there's something about celebrating the body by adornment, and there's a great long history of painted bodies, adornment. Women do it every morning. We adorn and paint our bodies. I don't see anything particularly wrong with it. The problem I have with tattoo is just so damn permanent, you know? And many of them are not particularly, for me, aesthetically pleasing. So, you know, we've got some problems with it. What I think would be the dark side of the tattoo is that it is not autonomy, but anarchy, in the sense that it's a reaction, a rebellion, rather than a sense of a celebration of the body or an adornment. So, you know, I think tattooing is, I feel ambivalent, as you obviously do, about tattoos. So I think it's maybe a current fad that, you know, that's kind of going through the collective, and as I said earlier, I guess that's not so bad, it's just so permanent. Somebody else? I hadn't come prepared to talk about tattoos, yes, please. We have one here. Yeah, good.
I was busy teaching students the Odyssey. New students here. And all my students say, why do I have to read this book?
Why do you have to read the Odyssey?
Read the Odyssey.
Yeah.
I don't have any answers for them, but I'm wondering if you have an answer.
Yeah. I think my answer is because it's my job to plant this seed in you so it'll bear fruit eventually when you will know why you're reading it. Thank God for all those teachers who forced me to do things I didn't want to do. As I told you, I grew up in small town Oklahoma, where in those days, as it is now, but particularly in those days, it was the primary vocation women could have, and so there were women's teachers colleges, and they taught those women to teach. And I'm so thankful for them who, you know, put those seeds in me that are bearing fruit tonight. So you put that Odyssey in those kids, and they will eventually, in their own growth, that seed will become a buckle bud, and then a bloom and a blossom. So keep broadcasting seeds.
Can you
Yeah.
tell us,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yes, yes.
You mentioned Elliot.
Uh-huh.
And, what came to mind is the journey to wholeness, the spiritual journey, as he talks about it,
Four quartets,
Thank
uh-huh.
you, for the, is that, you know, where the fire and the rose become light.
Yes.
Is that, would you say that that journey is a call to everyone, that particular path to wholeness is a call to everyone, or is that just the mystical path?
The path that Ellie talks about, or
In the four quartets.
yeah, I think it's archetypal. That is to say, archetypal means that it's an urge that every human being has to journey. You know, and I commend you to Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth, where he talks about the hero's journey, or his specific book on the hero's journey, which is called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And he would say it's archetypal, that we're all called to the journey to wholeness. Not everybody's conscious of the call, and some people refuse the call, but we're all called. I've rephrased the words out of Scripture that many are called, few are chosen. Well, all are called, few choose. And so to choose to be on a conscious journey, I think, you know, is health for me. But it's so easy to be distracted, and so you know, we have such survival needs, particularly in a socio-economic culture that we've become accustomed to, and the convenience therein, and we spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about and acquiring money. I think we have somebody up here, yes.
Yes, Barry Moss had a pretty big impact on an awful lot of us here.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could recall one of your more moving discussions with him, with us.
Well, thank you for that compliment, that I could do that. You hear about the group of men who got together regularly and went to the restaurant because the girls were so cute? And that same group then, they got older and grew a little older together, and they went because the food was good. And then they went because it was convenient, and then they went because they'd never been there before. I remember a conversation with Barry that I think it was after a baccalaureate that I did, where he was giving me a nice acknowledgement, but at the same time wondering if my message was inclusive enough. That he said, you offer such an apparent style of openness and inclusivity, but I just wonder if we couldn't make that more overt rather than, or explicit rather than implicit. And he said, I know that you are not an exclusivist by your style and by your message, but maybe it could be a little more explicit. He did that in the most graceful way. Somebody else, yes.
We are faced with kind of a juxtaposition between what I sense the American people would like to see, finding it towards wholeness,
Yeah.
versus what we see happening in our nation's capital, where there doesn't seem to be a lot of companionship, doesn't seem to be a lot of wholeness going on. In fact, they're downright insulting to one another, and then yet they're supposed to somehow come up with solutions. What are your thoughts on what advice would you give to try to see what we could do to try to help make that situation a little more whole, so that everyone can
Yeah, boy, I don't know. That's an appropriate question and a very thoughtful one. And there's so many things tied to that it's almost like a semester course to begin to unpack all the things that have led to that and what it means for it. I think that the primary issue is what Marshall McLuhan predicted was going to happen. McLuhan said that the day will come when the media makes the news rather than reporting it. And I think because we have such competition in the media for the news, they're creating news where there isn't news, and taking quotations out of context, pitting people against one another in order to make news. That I think it's a new phenomenon for us. You know, when Lyndon Johnson and Edward Dirksen were up there, we didn't know what they were having for dinner. I mean, they were in the back rooms figuring things out, and they lived in the same town. They weren't worried about re-election, on and on. It was a different whole kind of political realm, and now they are pit against each other by the news. For instance, this whole debt crisis ceiling thing that we all were bombarded with all summer, it was the 75th time that had happened. There was no news there. The media made it news, and then because it's news, then the politicians have to fight it out publicly, and it's just gotten ridiculous. So I think that's one thing that's behind this, is we've never been bombarded with something. We have too damn much news, you know, and then much of it is erroneous. I think that the idea of re-election is so important that nobody stays in Washington anymore. They're all at home trying to be re-elected and raise money. Used to, they all lived in Washington, went to dinner together, had drinks together, you know. They were companions, they were colleagues. And I don't think they're all there anymore at any time. So I think that's different. What's to be done? I think that the Buddhists have it much better than we when they talk about living mindfully and having compassion, and that rather than our being stirred up and anxious about what's going on in Washington, that we live as healthy as we can with our family and friends and neighbors, and that we live in the moment, in the present. The Dalai Lama was asked, what's the favorite moment in your life? And he said, the present one. And not worry about that stuff. You know, not be anxious. I've sort of quit watching it. So I would recommend it. Don't watch it. Yes.
Actually, your last answer may have been an answer for me as well, but all of us are parents here,
Yeah.
and our kids are growing up in a very performance-based society where your value is how you can perform on society's scale. And how do we help them achieve balance and work toward wholeness, not just performance and achievement?
Well, the first thing I want you to do is go watch the salmon spawn. You know what I'm talking about? You'll be swimming upstream. It's very difficult because you'll be swept away by a socioeconomic level of compete and defeat that is rampant. Let me tell you what happened. Now, this is a whole other lecture, but nonetheless. What the hell did you call me here for? The word adolescent came into the American vocabulary in 1900. Now, the reason for that was there was no such thing. You were a child, and then you became an adult. Little girls would go into menarche at 14 and be married at 15. The boys went to work immediately as soon as they could for economic reasons on the farm or at the factory. And with the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of affluence and then mandatory education, it changed to where children were able to have a period now between childhood and adulthood, which was called adolescence. That was new in history. Now, to carry that on, there's a new demographic that sociologists are calling emerging adult. And so adulthood is no longer 21, it's about 27 or 28. And because of affluence, children are able to delay or postpone growing up because they can afford to. You know, even as recently as when I graduated from college, that wasn't particularly recent, but in the scope of world history. You know, my folks thought when I was 21, here's 20 bucks, have a good life. I mean, you're on your own, you know? All right. so, there's a lot of things to talk about there, but one of them is we have three brains. We have the reptilian brain, which is a brain stem, which is about survival primarily. We have a mammalian brain, which is about herd and tribe, and that's that belonging thing, and it's very important to, you know, we talk about in terms of social beings, to belong to a family, to a group. Then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is the latest development in the human being and in humans as a species, okay? If you look at that clock that they say world history began here, well, human beings came in the last 5 minutes. And then the last minute, the prefrontal cortex is developed. All right, and that's what's called executive functioning, and has in an individual, the idea that I'm an individual. This is new. You know, this psychoanalytic babble that I've been giving here tonight is relatively new to think about individuals. In the Middle Ages, they didn't think about individuals. They belonged to something else. That's where they got their identity. This is new. All right, well, in the adolescent now, because they have so many of their needs met and problems solved, they don't develop what's called the executive functioning, which is in the prefrontal lobe. And the two primary things in executive functioning are delayed gratification and impulse control. All right, adolescents are not very good at that. That's why we don't want them having drugs and alcohol, because they're not very good at making decisions anyway. But if they have the sentinel asleep, they're not controlling impulse and they're not delaying gratification, okay? Now the point I'm making is we really need to be doing that for them. Discipline is a form of love. And setting boundaries and goals and requirements for children, I think, are important. At the same time, what happened in 1949, the whole idea of parents and children switched dramatically. What happened in 1949 is a pediatrician named Benjamin Spock wrote a book on parenting, in which, standing on the shoulders of Freud and Adler and Jung et al., he told the American reading public that the way you treated your kids affected the way they developed. Now, up until that time, even in my lifetime, children worked for the adults. You know, my brother and I were the ones who took care of the chores at the house. We did the lawn, we cleaned the house, we, you know, did all the chores around the house. We washed the dishes. And, you know, you'd go to a family gathering, reunion or something like that, and the men would all eat first, the children were off in the corner, and the women, of course, were where they belonged, which was in the kitchen. That's all changed. And since 1949, we're afraid that if we discipline our children, if we set limits, or that if we make any kind of requirement for them to be their own problem solvers, then we're afraid they're not going to develop well, and if they don't develop well, then that's going to shine badly on us and they won't get in a good school. And so now we're their chauffeurs, we're their butlers, we're their maids, we're their tutors. I mean, we work for them. And I think that that's been a dramatic change, and I think it needs to change. I think we need to go back and let children be their own problem solvers, and we need to let them play. I never see a child out in the yard playing anymore. If there is any play, it's organized. And the idea of letting a child play, and I don't mean on a computer, you know, to play together. So those are a couple of responses. And I think it's more difficult now to be a parent than when I was parenting my kids at Kincaid, because there were no cell phones or personal computers. It was a lot easier to parent in those days than it is in these days. That technology has a dark, dark side to it, doesn't it? I think one more, John, then we'll... It's so nice to be able to be a perfect parent since my kids are all grown. Yes?
Just a very simple question. You had mentioned the 4 F's of intimacy. Can you repeat?
I certainly can. Feelings, fears, failures, and fantasies. Okay? Thank you all very much. It's been a delightful evening, and